All right, we're going to go ahead and move on, but like I said, if you do have any questions, you can ask them to Bethany at any point and she'll let me know. Our objectives today are to discuss the Tennessee Family Violence Shelter Standards, talk about some common best practices in shelter, and talk about how we can encourage and create trauma-informed policies in our shelters across the state. So the Tennessee Violence Shelter Performance Standards are baseline minimum requirements to be addressed in shelters in order for those shelters to be eligible to receive funding from state or federal sources. So these are minimum best practice requirements that we're about to discuss. The core service requirements under the shelter standards are that shelters have a 24-hour crisis hotline that is staffed, and so that victims or survivors can call in at any point 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That shelters offer referrals for services within their communities as well as across the state to other shelters and nationally. That shelters offer counseling for family violence victims, whether that's in-house or with an outside counseling service. That shelters offer advocacy in-house for family violence victims, that advocates are staffed in shelter. That shelters have ways to arrange transportation for clients coming to shelter, especially, and ideally for clients who need help with transportation to employment or to appointments or things like that throughout the shelter process. That shelter services include follow-up with clients who leave the shelter to make sure that they are still stable, that they may need additional advocacy services and how they're doing, and that shelters offer community education and awareness around the issues of domestic violence. The Family Violence Prevention and Services Act says that shelter support services must never be presented to residents as being mandatory, nor should shelter residency be contingent upon residents and their dependents participating in shelter support services. So what this means is that living in shelter should not be mandatory for clients to receive your services, participate in other services. So be mutually exclusive. And ideally, we want to receive a full and complete continuum. Should be able to engage in shelter or just engage in. However, we've had who have been confused calling the coalition, who have called shelters and who the shelter may be full, they may not have any beds for them, and the clients have not been offered those additional supportive advocacy services. So they come away with the impression that if they don't live or reside in shelter, then they are not eligible for the other advocacy and supportive services that the shelter has, and that is not true. So we have to make sure our clients know that even if we don't have beds open, or even if they choose not to live in shelter or come into shelter, that our other services are available to them. So we're going to overview some of these best practices, and we'll talk about them briefly. We have a lot to talk about today, so I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. But again, if you have questions, you can always ask in the chat box or email me afterwards or call. So we want to make sure that supportive services are voluntary, like we just talked about, instead of mandatory. We should have a really robust, full range of supportive services, but we should never be requiring our clients to partake in those services unless they choose to do so. We should be encouraging a trauma-informed shelter environment, and part of being trauma-informed is respecting our clients' self-determination and their choices regarding what types of programs and services they partake in your organization. And we really want to overall create an environment where survivors can control their own lives. We get these survivors who have been out of control, who've had their power taken away from them for sometimes years. And when they come back into shelter, what we really want to do is give them a space where they can be in control of themselves, they can be making choices and determining what feels best and looks best for them. Remember that survivors must leave their homes in order to gain safety a lot of times, so they're leaving their possessions, they're leaving their homes, they're leaving a place that was supposed to be secure for them, and they're going out into something that's very unknown. And a lot of times shelter can seem incredibly punitive. They're going to a place where they have to share space with lots of other people and families, where they have, potentially have curfews, where they have chore lists, and it can seem like they're leaving a really incredibly toxic, abusive environment, but they're being punished for that by going to a place that's not comfortable, that's not welcoming, and not empowering to them. We really have to do everything that we can to mitigate the fact that survivors come to us as a consequence of someone else's behavior, of their batterer's behavior, and make sure that we are not making this seem like a punishment, that we're making a place that's open and welcoming and empowering for them. So what does a trauma-informed shelter environment look like? We really want to minimize power differentials, and when I talk about power differentials, I mean so often when we have survivors coming in shelter, they feel like the advocate or the shelter manager or their case manager is sort of the gatekeeper to services, to referrals, to counseling, to transportation, to housing. And so that puts those shelter employees in a huge position of power over that survivor, and we really want to minimize that and put survivors on equal footing, make sure that they know that they can make their own decisions, that their decisions will be respected, that advocates are here to help them find resources and open the door for resources, but not bar the way and not demand some kind of, you have to go to this counseling session or I won't give you this resource or recommend you for this. We never want to feel like we are in some kind of power position there. We want to make sure there is mutual respect and accountability, not only from survivors, but from the advocates and employees in the shelter, that we are all respecting each other and that we're all accountable to each other. We want to make sure it's an environment of shared learning. There is a lot that we can learn from survivors and from the people that we're working with. It's important to remember that each person that we work with is multifaceted. They have a lot of different viewpoints and education and life stories and interests that we can learn a lot from. A lot of the clients that we work with are, they're incredibly strong experiences they have to gain from working with us. Assume positive intent. We're not the experts on our clients' lives. We don't necessarily know what background they're coming from. It's important to remember that not every survivor has experienced the same types of abuse in the same ways. So not assuming that it's them being negative or purposefully doing something to environment. Survivors are, again, learning how to be in power and control of their own lives. And looking at advocacy as teamwork, really working together with our clients in order to figure out what goals are, what they want to do, and how to get it like a one-size. And so the ways that we can really survivors, the ways that shelters can be difficult, and to offer strategies to support that. You know, sharing space, being away from home, being without a lot of their possessions and a lot of their creature comforts. Maybe having to be open about discussing the range of responses people have to trauma. Nobody responds to trauma in the exact same ways. You know, there are some people who really may lash out. There are some people who really shut down and dissociate and kind of go inside themselves. Some people may think, or part of their response may be just kind of sitting on the couch all day. And that may seem really counterintuitive to us, but it's the way that people's brains and bodies are wired to respond to traumatic events. And being open to having that discussion and making sure these people, the survivors that we work with, don't feel like they are broken or that there's something wrong with them because of the way that they've responded. Remember that each survivor has unique strengths, they have unique resources, they have unique goals, and so working with them and really getting to know what those are and respecting that can really help us know how to best serve our clients. As far as the physical space goes, we want to really make a clean environment. We want to offer spaces for privacy, so make sure that bedrooms have doors that can shut, that can lock, making sure that, you know, while we definitely want to have some common spaces that are everyone in the shelter can gather and be communal, we definitely also want to have smaller spaces for privacy, or for, you know, we have just as many introverts as we have extroverts coming into shelter, so making sure that people have time and space where they can be alone, where they can be a little bit removed and read a book or just sit quietly is really helpful and affirming to a lot of survivors. Make sure that the decor is welcoming, that it's welcoming to LGBTQ survivors, that it's welcoming to survivors from all different faiths and all different cultures, that it's welcoming to children and doesn't feel like something where children can't play or can't touch. It's important to remember that even in the smallest, most rural communities, we have diverse survivors from diverse backgrounds and beliefs and cultures that are coming into our shelters. So making sure that our decorations and the things that we're hanging on the walls and the types of books that we have out are not excluding anyone is really important. Limit or eliminate graphic posters about violence. There's no reason for posters that are essentially awareness campaign posters about domestic violence to be in shelter. Offices, fine. If you want them in your business offices, that's one thing. There's absolutely no reason to have those graphic posters and awareness type posters within shelters. That can be incredibly triggering and incredibly ostracizing for a lot of survivors. So just really be aware of the types of visuals that you're displaying in your homes, or in your shelters rather, and make it feel very homey and welcoming. You know, have toys, have really inclusive artwork or images, have, you know, books from several different faiths or for several different interests. So, you know, there are simple, easy ways that you can make your shelter really welcoming. So does anybody have any questions about what we've talked about so far before we move on to talking about roles? All right. Again, if you have any questions as we go along, you can always add it in the chat box or email me afterwards. So we're going to talk a little bit about shelter rules. What's really important to remember is that your rules, whether you call them rules or policies or guidelines, however you phrase it, should always positively reflect your agency's values and your agency's mission. All written materials should be friendly. They should invite cooperation. They should invite respect. They should invite mutual accountability in their tone and in their wording. Things that are bold, italicized, things that are in all caps with a million exclamation marks don't feel friendly. Things that are worded like commands or demands don't feel friendly, don't feel respectful, don't feel like they're inviting collaboration. An example, a really good example, is this, which says that our rights and responsibilities to clarify expectations and roles, seek harmony in shelter where most families and individuals live together and share common spaces. We hope you will keep the common good and others' safety and comfort in mind while living here. And what's really great and important individuals in this one space, and it creates a sense of community for anyone who's entering shelter, rather than creating a sense of I'm in a boarding school, which can really happen in sort of more demanding and commanding materials. Rules should make a distinction between behaviors that facilitate communal living and behaviors that threaten residents' ability to stay in shelter. So washing dishes facilitates communal living, but should not be an issue that threatens a resident's stay in a shelter. On the other hand, violence within shelter does not facilitate communal living and is a behavior that should be clear that threatens the resident's ability to stay. So we're talking about the difference between cooperation and chores and common respectful day-to-day things and deal-breaking things, and they shouldn't be equated. Having really demanding rules where individuals coming in shelter feel like the smallest infraction of housekeeping or those types of things can get them removed from shelter can really feel threatening and alienating and feel like they're walking on eggshells. And again, it is taking away a lot of that power and control that we're trying to give back to our clients. You know, there's no reason that we can't inform information about respectful communal living, but they should be separate from information about things that threaten safety within shelter. And we want to, when possible, we can give information about communal living and respectful chores and those kind of things outside of the context of shelter rules or regulation. And it's also important to remember that in general, we don't need to go into great detail with survivors about the ways that they can get kicked out of shelter as soon as they arrive at shelter. Like, give them some time to adjust, to acclimate, to calm down, to be in the moment of the fact that they're in a new place. And then you can have that conversation about, you know, important rules and regulations and expectations. We should really focus on advocacy versus rule enforcement. It's our responsibility to meet survivors where they are. Like I said before, every survivor has a different experience. Every survivor has a different context for their behavior. You may have survivors who have for years been forced to clean and, you know, keep a spotless house, and every tiny kind of made up infraction has been the excuse for the abuse that they endure. So when they come to shelter, they may either be on the end of the spectrum where they are obsessively cleaning because they feel like if they don't, something bad is going to happen and they're going to get kicked out, or they may be on the complete other end of the spectrum where they can't even stand to look at dishwashing liquid because it's so triggering for them from the experiences that they've had in their home. So it's really important to think about where clients are. You know, if you have scheduled times that clients are supposed to meet with their advocates or with their support groups or whatever, and they sign up but they don't show up, instead of taking that as a punitive thing and being angry or just, you know, blowing them off as flighty or as forgetful or whatever, take the time to go to them, to check up on them, to see what's going on in their lives. You know, it's really an overwhelming thing sometimes to come to a meeting with an advocate because you know that you're going to have to talk about your abuse and your experiences. So there's some avoidance there as a form of self-protection. So just thinking about where our clients are at, what they're doing, and coming to them sometimes and being open and being respectful and understanding about it. An emphasis on rule enforcement, a really rigid emphasis on, you know, we have to have these certain chores done at this certain time and that kind of thing, undermines the trusting relationship that we're trying to create between staff and advocates and residents, and can result in really low morale. You have adults living in shelter that are not going to feel respected and valued and empowered if they're being treated like children at a boarding school might. And when residents break a rule, it's a really great opportunity to find out what their real needs are. And if the rule tends to be broken by a lot of residents, maybe it's time to reevaluate expectations and what that looks like. So it's important to think about controlling the environment and not controlling the rules, or controlling the environment of the shelter and not controlling the residents of the shelter. Again, if multiple residents repeatedly have difficulty with a particular rule, ask if it's possible that some kind of physical fix could alleviate that problem. Reevaluate that rule, see what's happening, because the common denominator in that situation is the rule, not the resident. For example, so if a resident is having difficulty keeping their rooms clean, if lots of them are, is it because they don't have enough closet or shelf space to organize their belongings? Is it because the rooms are too small and there's a lot of people sharing the rooms? How can storage be facilitated? How can we help with that? Or if women are required to keep children in sight at all times, but the children's play area is shut off in a completely separate room and it's not visible from the kitchen or from any other common areas, then it makes it really different for women to parent and keep their children in sight while they're also doing other things around shelter, cooking meals, or doing other things that need to get done. So we need to be aware of our expectations and how the shelter physically is set up. And so emphasizing rights and responsibilities. You have the right to be respected. You have the responsibility to be respectful. versus rules is a really good way to empower and dignify clients without being really rigid. So for instance, if an old rule states that residents must respect staff, other residents, and shelter property, you know, that's a good rule, but it boils down to you have the right to be respected and the responsibility to respect others. So things that feel very rigid versus things that feel like they're creating and enforcing a feeling of community and harmony. And I just put this image in because I think it's a great image about respect, and it's something that in lieu of those violent awareness images could be a great thing to be posted in shelter. So another example, you're responsible for the care and supervision of your own children at all times versus you have the right to be supported in your role as a parent. You have a responsibility for your children, but you have the right to be supported and to get help when you need it and to get education and resources when you need it, and to parent in a way that feels good to you and goes along with your values and your goals for your children and your relationship with your children. Children should be in bed by 9 p.m. versus each family has the right to safety, to privacy, to establish schedules that allow each member adequate rest, peaceful time, and time to complete schoolwork as well as family obligations. Some children, you know, and some families may want a bedtime of 9 p.m. or even earlier, but some older children or children that have different schedules or different values or different tasks to complete may, you know, be more functional and more open to a bedtime of 10 or 11 or midnight or whatever it is, and respecting that family's right to parent and to create their own schedules and allow their own lives to continue on as undisrupted as possible is more important than being rigid about a 9 p.m. bedtime. And making sure that staff are modeling the same rights and responsibilities that we are giving to each of our clients. You have the right to be heard. You have the right to self-determination of how you choose to, you know, what you choose to partake in or how you choose to parent or those kind of things that we've talked about. Every resident, including children, have the right to live without the threat of violence. They have the right to a healthy, sober, and drug-free environment. So all of those things, we want to make sure that our staff are modeling just as we, you know, want our clients and our residents to be. Every resident has the right to a clean and safe physical environment. Every resident has the right to keep their presence at our program confidential, and that's incredibly important. And it's important, again, for our staff to make sure that they're modeling that and that they're not speaking about who may be in shelter, even in vague terms, with people in the community. You have the right to reside in a program that works for you. You know, not everyone is going to be the best fit for every program, and not everyone is going to be comfortable or feel secure in shelter. If shelter living is not working out for someone, then that's not a character defect. That just means that we need to, you know, think about what parts of the program are not working out with them, with their schedules or with their culture or whatever it may be, and maybe that, you know, maybe there is a better place that we can help them find that does work better for them. But then there are also some rules that are going to be deal breakers, that are going to be those important rules that are, going to be things that we want to make sure are really nipped in the bud and removed from shelter. But those rules are going to be around safety and security. So alcohol and drugs within the shelter environment, violence within the shelter environment, breaking confidentiality of other clients or of the shelter location or themselves, bringing weapons into shelter. All of those things are really important to remember, that they are not only affecting the safety of that one individual, but the shelter community as a whole. And so when violations happen with those kinds of deal breaker rules, then there are some best practice recommendations regarding asking people to exit shelter. First of all, we really want to give, before giving someone a warning, before asking someone to leave, we really want to make sure we're looking at effective communication. For instance, we have had, we have spoken to survivors who have been removed from shelter for having a bus from work drop them off in front of the shelter. Now, on one hand, we want to really be respectful of the shelter environment, of the confidentiality of the shelter, and that's absolutely true. On the other hand, in this particular instance, the only person on that bus was our shelter client, and the bus driver was a former client from the shelter who already knew the shelter location. So kicking that client, that resident, out of shelter, while the rule may seem black and white, it's important to really assess each individual situation and communicate about the infraction or supposed infraction. Because while we want to make sure that everyone is safe, we want to really also make sure that our clients are being treated fairly and respectfully. The program should always come from a place of trying to make a situation work versus being anxious to move someone out of the program. As we said, there are always going to be clients who don't necessarily fit or don't feel comfortable within a shelter environment, but our priority always, always, always is to make those clients, make sure they're safe, make sure they're secure. So really making sure that we're communicating the safety of a client is incredibly important. And make sure that you make really thorough efforts to ensure that every woman understands the expectations, understands the responsibilities, and understands the reasoning behind all of those really important safety issues. And we really want to make sure, especially when it comes to a question of limited English proficiency, that we're really communicating with these clients in ways that they can understand. We want to make sure that at least two people, at least two staff, should always be involved in any decision concerning an existing resident. And if a resident has a conflict with a particular staff member, then it needs to be two other staff, not that staff member that the resident has conflict with. So I want to make sure that every resident is being treated fairly, that they're being communicated with openly, that they understand what's happening, and that there is a chance, an opportunity for them to be heard as well. Women and children's safety should always be taken into consideration when a woman is being asked to leave shelter. All too often we hear from clients, from survivors who are asked to leave shelter, whether it be due to a rule infraction or due to you know, a time limit within a shelter, that they've reached their time limit within shelter, and they're asked to leave shelter with no alternative for where they're going, for where they're going to be living, for where their children are going to be living once they leave shelter, and that's incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly unsafe, and it's really a disservice to these clients. And a lot of times we see these clients go back home to their abusers because they have nowhere else to go. So anytime, for any reason that a woman is being asked to leave shelter, obviously we should take into consideration the safety of everyone involved, but part of that safety is making sure that man, woman, children, whoever is being asked to leave shelter has somewhere to go and has a safe plan for moving forward. If possible, when rule infractions are involved, residents should be asked to leave during the daytime. They should not be put out at night. It's a lot more dangerous. And advocates should really work to make sure that they have another safe place to go. So how do we make these really minimal rules work? How do we go from a shelter that is a rule-based environment to a shelter that is a rights and responsibilities-based environment with those very minimal rules regarding safety? First of all, the rules that we do have should, again, reflect the agency's mission and core values. And the rights and responsibilities that each client is given should reflect the agency's mission and core values. And so the rules should really reflect what is necessary to keep residents safe. There should be routine reflection and reevaluation of the rules. Again, you know, if multiple clients are having an issue with one particular rule or one particular expectation within shelter, then that needs to be reevaluated on the basis of what can we do to help them, and what, you know, what within the rule or within the shelter environment is making that challenging. There should be really healthy staff working conditions, which means we should be addressing vicarious trauma, we should be addressing burnout, we should be encouraging self-care within staff, because staff who are experiencing untreated vicarious trauma, who are experiencing unaddressed burnout symptoms, are going to be have a much harder time relating to residents in shelter, being empowering, being open, being respectful, communicating effectively. So in order to make sure that our staff are being the best that they can be, we have to be giving them the tools and the support and the care that goes along with that. Residents and staff are equal parts of a shelter community, engaging together and learning how to live with one another. So again, making sure that we are equals within a shelter environment instead of having staff or advocates in a power over clients. Making sure that we have good collaboration and communication with other community partners and providers, with other shelters that are in the area, with alcohol and drug programs, with counseling and therapy programs, with job placement programs, with, you know, education, with parenting programs, any of those things, with other community resources, Department of Children's Services, law enforcement, anything like that. Because the better our collaboration are with those core resources, the better that we can make sure that our client has a really holistic and inclusive continuum of care and resources. And again, and I cannot stress this enough, making sure that we have really clear communication with each resident with what's going on in their lives, with what their individual goals and resources and challenges are, and to really check in and make sure what place that they're in each day. So when we're evaluating a shelter's rules and deciding what can be kept and what can be changed and what needs to be looked at, we need to ask a few questions. First of all, we need to ask, does this rule mirror the abuser's control? Are we being really punitive about small things that are putting us in unnecessary positions of power and control over the client, whether that be about cleaning or dishes or laundry or childcare or being in rooms or making up beds or curfews or whatever it is. Are we exerting unnecessary control over clients? Why do we have this rule? Is this rule necessary, or is this, is this something that could be addressed with some communal living responsibilities and rights and conversation? Are the concerns this rule reflects still relevant? We have shelters who have been open, for 40 years. Have these rules been looked at with changing society and changing times? Is this rule still something that makes sense for our current clients? Can we address this issue less punitively without a rule? Can we make something, is it included in our clients' rights and responsibilities? Is it something that can happen with some community building within the shelter without having rules about this particular issue? Is this about staff time management? Does this particular rule provide a shortcut from complex advocacy or from uncomfortable conversations? So if you have a rule around clients having to have mandatory meetings with their advocate every week and clients having to sign up for those, and if clients don't come or don't sign up, they're punished, is this just a shortcut for the advocate not having to take the time to seek out each client and check in with them? Do these rules and the need to enforce them create the kind of environment that we want in shelter? Do they create a positive environment or a negative environment? If an advocate feels like they have to enforce dish duty on clients, is that placing them in a role of parenting adult clients that they don't want to be in? Is that placing them in power? Is it creating an environment where residents are frustrated or where they're supported? What are we looking at? Does this rule actually accomplish its purpose? Does it actually create safety or just the illusion of safety? And we're going to talk a little bit more about rules around phone usage, which I think really goes under this category. So are we really making clients safer, or are we trying to control very minute aspects of their lives that give the illusion of safety or control? Is this rule more controlling than basic social norms and accountability would be outside the program? So are we putting more rules on a client than if they were living in a different, more supportive environment? Would we really make a resident leave over violations of this rule? Does it make sense? Do rules surrounding, for instance, housekeeping, would we really want to force a resident out of program for violation of rules? Is the risk that someone would very occasionally engage in this behavior worth the cost of subjecting all residents to the rule all the time? Is the rule burdensome to residents? Is it burdensome to a particular group of residents? Is it, for instance, is it exclusionary to residents with disabilities, to residents with limited English proficiency, to residents with or without children, to residents with or without their own form of transportation? So making sure that we are being inclusive of all residents at all times. Does this rule reflect an advocacy approach to problem solving? Does it interfere with or support women's decision making? And so a lot of the challenges that we see when we're talking about rules and whether they are valid rules or whether they can be changed or whether they can be softened or gotten rid of entirely, we are talking about phone safety, medication safety, curfews, alcohol and drug issues, serving men, boys, transgender individuals, LGBT individuals, rules around parenting, rules around confidentiality. In particular, phone safety. The Tennessee Family Violence Shelter Performance Standards say a shelter program shall provide residents access to telephone communication at all times. Phones can be a life-saving device for victims and survivors of sexual violence, enabling them to call resources, to call law enforcement, to call advocates. And the best practice is the safety plan around the use of phones while residing in shelter rather than denying access. The safety plan around, for instance, making sure that cell phones' GPS are off so that they can't be tracked, or making sure that they're not pinging their location when they take pictures. We have a lot of shelters who want to enforce a rule, for instance, that survivors can never communicate in any way, shape, or form via telephone or other means with their abusers while they're in shelter. Well, that's just not realistic. A lot of survivors have children. A lot of survivors have custody issues, and many, many other issues surrounding a need to communicate with this abuser. So safety planning around that communication rather than punishing for communication. Staff, another idea is staff and residents can change phone settings to airplane mode when they're not making calls, so that there's no data going back and forth if that's a concern. So it's just, there's a lot of ways to work around phone safety without taking away survivors' access to phones, which is a really important tool for their safety, again. Medication safety. So a shelter program shall provide a centrally located secure storage for medications belonging to residents. But the storage should be accessible by adult residents. If you are counting pills, documenting pills, monitoring dosage, or giving any kind of advice about a client's medication, whether it is Prozac or Tylenol, you could be seen as dispensing medication, and you could be criminally liable for that. It's completely and utterly against the law for you to do so. A best practice is for shelter programs to provide a locker for each survivor to secure their medication. Some programs provide that locker to be in a centrally located area, such as a kitchen or a common room. Some programs provide individual locker or lockers in each closet of rooms that survivors are staying in. Just as long as it can be locked and survivors have access, whether it's a combination lock or a key or whatever, we want to make sure that survivors have access to their own medication, can inform taking their own medication without you dispensing or monitoring that. Some survivors may have certain issues with memory, or may have physical or mental issues that they are being medicated for. that make it very difficult for them to remember to take their medication. So, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, Susie, have you taken your medicine today? But we are not monitoring, we are not handing out that medication. And again, when clients, for instance, have a headache or maybe fall down and get like a cut on their hand that could need, basic first aid or a Band-Aid or Neosporin or Tylenol, you are in no way to dispense or give advice surrounding that medication, and a way to make sure that clients have access to that medication without you dispensing the medication is to have an accessible, well-stocked first aid kit put up in a place where children cannot get to it or reach it, but where clients know, oh, you have a headache, if you want some Tylenol, there's little individual packets of Tylenol in the first aid kit on the top of the refrigerator. Curfews should be set to be the least intrusive on survivors' lives. Some people work nights, some people are night owls, some people go to school and have to stay up late hours in the libraries. Some people have really good friends or family support systems that they may occasionally want to go to dinner with while they're living in shelter. Whatever the reason is, making sure that we're understanding of survivors' lives and not basing curfews around our own values of when dinner time or bedtime or whatever should be. Do curfews interfere with work? Do they interfere with children's activities? Do they interfere with survivor mental health? Really thinking about how those things interact. A shelter program shall prohibit possession and use of weapons, alcohol, or illegal drugs on its premises. However, we need to recognize that survivors may use substances as survival or coping mechanisms. Women may begin substance misuse in response to trauma or be encouraged to misuse substances by their abusers. And again, we cannot prohibit clients or residents from using alcohol outside of shelter premises. So really understanding where survivors are coming from, that they may have developed these coping skills or coping strategies that are not healthy, but making sure that we are not prohibiting or punishing clients outside of, for what they do outside of shelter.
There's a question about medication.
Okay.
It says, I was under the impression that medications needed to be in a locked space, but you mentioned keeping a first aid kit with Tylenol above the fridge where kids can't reach. As long as a child cannot reach the medications, it is okay to have medication in an unlocked space? Question.
So that was a question about medications in locked or unlocked spaces. If we are talking about a client's prescription medication, then that should be in a locked space. If we are talking about over-the-counter medications such as Tylenol, then making sure, again, that they are in areas where children cannot access them is enough. Does that make sense to everyone? And a really good recommendation is to make sure that instead of maybe instead of buying large bottles of Tylenol or those kind of over-the-counter medications, that we have those little individual one-dose packets, for instance, that make things a little bit easier there. So serving men or serving transgender individuals. Individuals may be deemed eligible for services if they are adults, 18 years of age or older, or emancipated minors, regardless of sex, mental function, or handicap. So if someone is a survivor of domestic violence, then they are eligible for your services as long as they are above the age of 18 or they're emancipated, regardless of their gender. We must provide the same level of service for male survivors that we do for female survivors. If you do not feel comfortable Sheltering survivors in your shelter, a lot of programs use hotels. There is a problem with that, however. When VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, was reauthorized in 2013, they included new non-discrimination provisions to include individuals of all gender or sexual orientation. And part of that non-discrimination provision requires that services offered to anyone of any gender or sexual orientation must be equal or equitable to the services offered to any other resident or client. So if you're telling a male victim that they must stay in a hotel, are you able, for instance, to give them the same length of stay in a hotel as you would give to a female client within your shelter? Because if you're not, if you're giving female clients, for example, a month stay in shelter, but you're only able to give a male client a 2 or 3 day stay in a hotel, that is not an equitable provision of service. And again, if you are providing resources and advocacy and counseling within or anything else within a shelter setting, and a male victim who is living in a hotel cannot or has difficulty accessing those same resources and the same level of advocacy, then you're not providing them equitable services. Serving teenage boys, again, it's the same thing. If you would allow a woman to come into shelter and bring her female child who is 16 or 17, who is a secondary or potentially another primary victim of the violence in the home, then you cannot, under any circumstances, refuse to serve a teenage boy. Never, ever make a teenage boy feel like he's either A, the barrier for his mother's safety, either you can come into shelter without your son and leave him with the abuser, or you can't come into shelter at all. Never make a child feel that way. And don't assume that a teenage boy is a batterer any more than you would assume that a teenage girl is a batterer. You know, all of these are, again, secondary or potentially primary victims that are just underage. If you would allow any other child into shelter, you need to allow teenage boys into shelter. Best practice is to keep a woman and her children, including teenage boys, together. Ensure access and services for all battered women and their minor children. Consider male staff or, partnering in mentoring programs if you feel like you don't currently have the resources, the advocacy resources to work with teenage boys as you would with teenage girls. Consider partnering with other community programs to help you with that, but don't exclude them from services. And again, if you are not offering equitable services to individuals regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, you're violating the Violence Against Women Act. You're violating federal law if you receive any state or federal funding. So it's really as simple as that. Shelter programs should have services available for child residents. They should discuss how batterer's behavior impacts the survivor's parenting. A lot of times survivors don't have time to learn how to parent because they are mediating or protecting or spending so much of their time reacting to batterer behavior. Believe that the survivor knows what's best for their children and support that their roles as parents. Not everyone is going to raise their children the same way, with the same culture, with the same beliefs, with the same rules. And just because you would enforce a certain rule or parenting style doesn't mean that that's appropriate for everyone or that it should be forced on every parent. Affirm a mother's authority. Don't undermine. Mothers, not staff, need to be the primary caregiver who meets their children's needs, sets their limits, and determines what their children should be doing. There are going to be sometimes multiple mothers with multiple children within shelter, and each mother may have different rules and parenting styles for their children. But it's part of our jobs as advocates to understand and respect each particular mother's or father's style of parenting and encourage and respect that and not undermine those rules. And it's also, again, important to remember that children who come from abusive environments, even though the mother may say the child has never directly witnessed abuse, we know that children are affected by the environments that they come from, even if they never directly witness it with their eyes. It's important to safety plan with children just as much as you would safety plan with their parents. They may have to go to visitation with their, with the abusive parent, so safety planning around that. Emotional safety planning with children, it looks a little bit different than adults, making sure that they understand that violence is not their fault, that they are never to get between their two parents when violence is happening, teaching them how to dial 911 and when that's appropriate, teaching them places in their home that they can go, teaching them that, again, they have rights and responsibilities they have the right to be in a safe environment, that violence is wrong, that they didn't do anything to cause the violence. And so safety planning around all of those things with children is incredibly important. Briefly about confidentiality, make sure that if you are using databases for storage of client information, especially if those databases are web-based or cloud-based, that you really give clients the opportunity of informed consent to have any identifying information placed in those databases, where it could potentially be insecure. Never use a client's full name or identifying information in email, because email, even if it is a secure server, is not secure when we're sending it out into the world. Making sure that if you have cameras inside shelter, you let clients know where they are, what's happening, where that camera feed goes, and that cameras aren't placed inside bathrooms and bedrooms and private spaces. And that each client has the right to their privacy. They have the right to determine who hears their story, under what circumstances their story is shared, how much of their story is shared with you or anyone else. And they have the right to their privacy just like anyone else outside of a shelter would. So, some really great resources. We have a lot of this stuff on our website under the resource tab, including the Tennessee Shelter Standards. NNEDV and also the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health has a lot of really amazing information on creating trauma-informed spaces within shelter. And the Washington and Missouri coalitions have some great information on that as well. If you would like more information about creating trauma-informed spaces, or if you would like individual assessment or education or training or review of your rules or anything like that within your shelter, if you're trying to become more trauma-informed or if you just want a little help with the process, please don't hesitate to contact me. That's part of my position here at the Coalition, is to help shelters become more open and more trauma-informed and do staff development and training. So please don't hesitate to contact me anytime. If you guys have any questions about anything that we've gone over today, any of the topics that we have talked about or maybe haven't talked about that you wanted to get to, I am going to give a couple minutes for anyone who may have a question to type into the question box, and to also remind you that your especially if you weren't around for the very beginning of the webinar, that your certificate and a copy of the PowerPoint are available under the handouts in your on the right-hand side of your screen in your webinar toolbox. So I want to make sure you have a moment to download those. You just have to click on them. It'll open a tab in whatever browser you're using where you will be able to save them to your computer. So I want to go ahead and give you a moment to do that and to ask any questions you may have before we wrap up. And here is my email address. Go back so you can see that again in case you do need to contact me for any training or for any reason. You have that available to you, or you can always call the coalition and ask for me. All right, it doesn't seem like we have any questions. I'm going to give about 10 more seconds or so to make absolutely sure that everybody has time to find and click on their certificate or on a copy of the PowerPoint if they want to download either of those. But otherwise, we are wrapped up here. So thank you so much for attending the webinar. Again, if you have any questions or concerns, let me know. We also recorded the webinar today, so if you would like a copy of that recording, we will have it up on our YouTube page, which is Tennessee Coalition. I think it's youtube.com/TN Coalition or something to that effect. But if you just search TN Coalition, it will come up, and we will have this recording available for your use. So have a wonderful day, and we will go ahead then and close everything out.